Hi, everyone. I'm Roberta McIntyre. I'm President and CEO of FireSafe Sonoma. Thank you all for taking out some time this beautiful evening in Sonoma County to join us and learn some really cool stuff. I chair the Countywide FireSafe Council, and FireSafe Sonoma is a member organization with what's called the Resilient Landscape Coalition. And it's a group of us endeavoring to provide education and outreach specific to resilient landscaping for fire safety. And the cool thing about this group is that most of the others, not me, I'm kind of the tag along, but they're mostly creating content that is nuanced for the various areas of the county. So for example, if you're in, Petaluma area, southern Sonoma County, some of the things you may want to do with your landscaping or should do with your landscaping there for fire safety, it's going to be a little different than if you're in like West County where, there's a lot of conifers and forests, or even up, in North Sonoma County. Where you might run into a lot of live oaks and things like that. So there are so many different geographies within Sonoma County that the program is or needs to be and is nuanced for those various areas. And so the other members of the organization is Master Gardener Program, and Mimi's here to represent them. And then there's also the Sonoma Ecology Center. And we have some members of the Sonoma Ecology Center here too. Jennifer Roberts is also here with the Habitat Corridor Project. She's kind of put all this together for us. A lot of it, we've all worked together on it. And then Eric is with the Sonoma Ecology Center, as well as Rachel. And then Becca is with FireSafe Sonoma. She's one of our Climate Corps fellows, and she's helping out with the material as well today. So again, thank you guys all for joining us this evening, and get your glass of wine ready if you haven't already settled in. And we're going to learn a lot of cool stuff. So take it away, you guys.
Awesome. So I think I'll be beginning here. My name is Eric Schoohs from the Sonoma Ecology Center. I'm a land management planner, and I will ask you to bear with me for a moment while I get my slides up. All right, so we'll start here really quick.
Need to do the Spanish information as well, right? I forgot about that.
Yep. Oh, yeah. Actually, I think it would be worth it to start with that. So if Daniel wants to take over for a moment, I can stop my share.
And greetings, everyone. Today's event is also going to be taking place in Spanish. Therefore, in order to participate in English and be able to listen to any questions or comments that are made today in Spanish, please go to the bottom of your screen, and in the globe that says interpretation, please click on it and select English. And if you hear two voices at the same time and that distracts you, although there are different volumes, please, you can mute original audio, and that way you will only hear one voice at a time. Now we'll be making this same announcement, but in Spanish for Spanish speakers. Muy buenas tardes, saludos a todos. La reunión de hoy también se llevará a cabo en español. Para escuchar y para participar en español, por favor, vayan a la parte inferior de su pantalla, hagan clic en el globo terráqueo y elijan español. Si escuchan dos voces a la vez, pueden silenciar el audio original y de esa manera escucharán únicamente una voz. Gracias.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel. I will dive in now. All right, so each slide will have English and Spanish, as Daniel was just speaking to. I'm here as the member of Sonoma Ecology Center, representing the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, to present on gardening in the defensible space zone. Resilient land is biodiverse, drought resistant, fire-wise, it's beautiful. It's got all of the benefits that we all would love to see to make it thrive. Okay. Just want to take a moment, let you know this is a webinar. You won't have audio, you won't have video, and it is being recorded, as you can see on your screen. Any questions that you have, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. Rather than trying to put them into the chat, things get lost really easily, and we want to make sure that we can get to whatever questions you have. Also want to point out to the right here on this slide, we love natives, we love beautiful plants here. They support a lot of biodiversity, habitat at all levels of the biosphere, I guess, of the living realm. And here's a few that we enjoy, including some Eriogonum and Monardella or mint. All right. So we just talked about this a little bit, Roberta covered, but you can see the members of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition. It's been around for going on 5 years now and supports people to understand more about ecological health and safety at the same time, especially in the defensible space. But we're also doing work outside of the defensible space, which I'll touch on a little bit through this presentation. So you have Fire Safe Sonoma, Roberta just introduced us. There's other members as well, like Marika Ramsden, the Habitat Corridor Project, which is April Owens, but also Jennifer Roberts, who's here today and will present the third portion of this webinar, and UC Master Gardener Program, which is represented by Enright, who is the program manager there. All right, the next part to say, of course, is we partnership with a lot of people, but we're especially proud to partner with the fire prevention, whether that's CAL FIRE or local districts. They play a huge role in informing the information that we share, and we really enjoy working with them. So happy and proud to be able to do so. Oops, sorry about that, folks. So if you want to find more information about us, you can go to resilientlandscapescoalition.org. We have a wonderful website with a lot of this information available. We'll have recordings up after this is done if you have any more information or questions. And you can go there. All right. So here we are looking at a beautiful landscape. What makes it beautiful? We have this nice ground cover. There's no open soil under an oak tree, a California live oak. And this herbaceous or non-woody plant right in front of us is Cooperative, sometimes better known as either alum root or coral bells. That's right. Kind of showing off, right? So you have food for different pollinators, you have ground cover, you have things that are keeping water in place with root systems. And if you look at the bottom there, there's not open soil, but instead in places where there aren't plants, you see wood chips, you see organic material, which actually helps to hold water. It helps keep soil in place, has many different benefits. And this is what you can have in your defensible space. You have the beauty, you have the sustainability and multiple benefits of ecological approaches. And at the same time, that means it's biodiverse. All right. And that's in juxtaposition to kind of these two farther spectrum. That's the sweet spot versus having a moonscape or a place that is pretty much just rock and gravel. You might have a few different succulent plants, but generally, as you can see in this photo on the left, there's not a lot happening. And the detriment there is that there's no food for insects. There's no place for birds to nest or live. And at all levels, it's just kind of hurting as far as biodiversity and benefits go. On the other side, you have the overgrown garden. It's kind of overly dense. It doesn't add as much biodiversity. There's not availability for small plants to be growing on the ground. We want to find that nice middle scape between the moonscape and the beautiful, or the overgrown garden, that beautiful middle of ground. All right. So here we see an oak tree. A lot of us live here in Sonoma County because it's so beautiful. We really enjoy going out for hikes and getting to appreciate these great grasslands covered by oaks. There's like the watersheds around are heavily influenced by what is covering the ground. And if we want to have healthy, beautiful grassland, chaparral, oak woodlands, we need to make sure that we take care of them. If you look into the past, this land was stewarded traditionally by indigenous folks for thousands and thousands of years, and it was built upon using fire as a tool on the land. That was used for hunting, that was used for, developing places to collect different plants for food and for, fiber, other things that you might do. That kind of habit helped form healthy landscapes that give us, smaller fuels, less catastrophic fire, and ultimately brought us back to, or should say, left us in a place where the land was healthy and functioning. What we've seen happen is, as it hasn't been managed by fire, the land here in Sonoma County, you have a fuel buildup over many, many decades. It isn't taken care of. And then you're left in this position where there's a lot of fuel. Small intensity fires aren't possible anymore because things will light up really quickly. And the only way for a reset to happen is by having fire come in and catastrophically do damage. And with us moving more and more out into the wild interface, housing is not as minimal or as centrally placed as it used to be. We have issues. All right, one moment here. So, speaking of wildfire, so a lot of you have been around, I suspect, from in the recent years. Fire has been a huge issue. You can see in the background here the footprints of different fires that have happened. And if you look at a historic map before this, you'll see that most fires are relatively small. They went quickly, we're under 10,000 acres, but many of the fires that are on this map right here, which I'll talk to a little bit on the next screen, actually are over 50,000 acres. They're massive, unprecedented, and that's when we're running into cities. That's when we're running into issues of people being, hurt or houses being burned down. And at the same time, doing so much damage to the plant life and things that are still left alive that you lose biodiversity, you lose water retention, you have bare soils and sediment washing down creeks, which then damages fish life and it cascades downward. And this is happening all at the same time as we're moving into a drier, warmer climate. Just kind of adding on to that. So here you can see the fires that I spoke to. In the 2010s, you start to have a lot larger fires. In the 2020s, especially large. So that's where we ran into the Tubbs fire, the Kincaid fire in 2019, the Nuns fire in 2017, Walbridge, and Glass fire are all names that you might have heard. Those were all over 50,000 acres. And that's the issue that we have with not having regular fire on the ground. It becomes more of an issue. It's also hard for firefighters to manage such large burning areas. So here I just want to point out how our understanding and approach has changed moving forward in time. So in 1965 is when we first started thinking about modifying vegetation around houses. And so that's what we would call now defensible space. In 2005, that was expanded to a set limit of 100 feet. That's what we now are used to using. So 0 to 100 feet is where you're implementing this landscaping and ecological approach. And then beyond that, you can also do work as well, but we'll cover that in other workshops. In 2008, we started calling it the wildland urban interface, or the WUI. That's something you might hear a lot in this area, or when you're talking in these circles. And that's just stating the fact that as we've moved out of cities that are very dense, we've moved into areas where we're closer with wildlands, with areas where it's unmanaged forest or less managed compared to someone's backyard. And that's kind of created a big change and shift for us in how we need to approach stewarding the land, or specifically our defensible space. And in 2020, another big thing is Zone 0 was created, or mandated, I should say, in these defensible spaces. So the 0 to 5 zone, you should have basically bare earth. It all comes back to an assessment of risk. Some people would prefer not to have risk, right? But then you end up with a moonscape. Or on the other hand, you could go for a little bit more risk and have some beauty. But it all comes down to your personal approach. If you care to add a little bit more beauty, you can kind of approach that through the lens of you're helping biodiversity, you're helping water retention. And so, well, technically, if there's a plant there, it can burn. There's a lot of ways to avoid actually putting your house at risk, which a little bit later, Mimi will go into kind of how fire works in the defensible space zone, and help work on mitigating those. And some of those things that you can think about as you go are your family safety, of course, caring for your house, but also firefighter safety, and all the other, sorry, there was something on my screen here, and all the other things that are associated with where you live, right? Your house, the things that you own, and what you care about. It's all about taking into account what you care for, balancing priorities, and figuring out what the best action is for you. Yeah. All right, now we're into the part that I'm a little bit more well-versed in: ecology, sustainability. These are things that obviously are very important when you're working with any sort of living creatures, right? If you were to go in and cut out anything that's plant material, etc., you're also damaging the approach of butterflies, of wrens, like this down in the tree. So let me get back to my notes a little bit here. So we have a really great opportunity to think of our home landscapes through the lens of fire resiliency, while making them beautiful and multi-beneficial to these other species. Right here, you can see Doug Tallamy, who is an entomologist. He works for UC at different times, and he wrote a book called Bringing Home Nature. And in that, you see this quote: "For the first time in history, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife." I don't think that can be stated any more importantly. Like, you have the opportunity to make a big impact right in your own backyard. And in fact, at this point, because we have habitat degradation and we have places becoming less connected for these species, you have a lot of difficulty for them to survive. All right, so what do our ecosystems and around our house, like our gardens, as we're speaking to, actually offer? Right here is just a few things, but this is a short list, and I'll add a few more. But if you have the right plants, they use less water. They tend to hold soil. They're adapted to a landscape with fire in mind. So even if a fire were to come through, they don't die. They actually thrive. This equals carbon sequestration. If you have native grasses, their roots can grow up to 20 feet down, and helps keep carbon out of the atmosphere and combat the heating environment. Obviously, at the same time, they're habitat wildlife, as I've spoken to a few times. And the other thing to think about is not just water conservation, but also filtration. and you're helping to sink it in place, spread it, and keep it available later into the season, into the dry season. Okay, so how can you do this? People beyond me will, or past me, I should say, specifically Jen will touch on a little bit more about pallets, but one of the main points to add here is that choosing native species, as I've spoken to, is incredibly important. These species have evolved here and work together very well. They help support the lower level insects and other organisms that we don't often think about because we don't really see, but insects and even upwards to birds, like they feed on these organisms, and it allows them to basically survive. Some of the things that we recommend are just plant islands. You can disconnect these bunches and groups so that there's basically a fuel break for fire to come through, and they host water later into the season. How is that? I just want to talk a little bit about the native species. So as I was just speaking to, things that have grown up here are cued in. In this case, oak trees, they offer a ton of food. Indigenous folks for many millennia have eaten acorns, but also caterpillars eat leaves, wrens eat the caterpillars. It moves up from there. Something like 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars are eaten by a single nesting pair of wrens in a bird season. So having that food availability scales up and helps the rest of the ecosystem. And then also thinking in the smaller scale. So leaf litter is not only supporting for food, insects, birds, microorganisms, the roots, but it's holding water in place, and it's a thriving ecosphere. It's a thriving place of living items. All right. So there's a few other tasks or a few other ways that you can avoid damaging these natives. And that's just thinking about, well, what's living there? How is it using the land? And caring for that, and thinking about ways to not basically hurt it. So very, very straightforward, but maybe overlooked at times, is pruning and trying to avoid doing that during nesting season. Generally March to August. Some people, if you live around redwoods especially, should maybe be careful a little bit sooner in the season. You have northern spotted owls that nest as early as January in certain places, and other nesting birds will go a little bit beyond August. But a good way, a good time to think about is March to August for most species. Great. So we talked a little bit about sequestering carbon before as well. What does that mean? Healthy soils sequester a lot of carbon, meaning that they pull it into the ground and they keep it out of the air. It's cooling down. It's keeping less of the greenhouse gases from basically hurting the environment. It's helping retain moisture when you have more organic material on the ground. And many of these species that host a lot of carbon that are native, like I said, are fire adapted earlier. So even if they burn, it's a small bit. They're used to surviving through fires in their trees, whether it's a redwood or an oak tree. And if it's a grass, then the tops of them burn, they're perennials, and most of their energy is in carbon underground. So I just want to encourage you all to take some time, walk around outdoors, just get more intimate with the space that we're in. You'll see different organisms running around. If you're lucky, you'll see a California quail at the bottom. They're always very goofy with their little head feather. But it's about understanding what's using the space and then trying to support those living creatures. And when you garden, as Doug Talamy said, as I quoted earlier, you have the opportunity to care for those things and support biodiversity right in your backyard. So take the time and enjoy the process. All right, and with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Mimi. She's the program manager for the UC Master Gardeners, as I said, and she's gonna talk about design and maintenance principles.
Thank you, Eric. Bear with me, everybody, while I do the always nerve-wracking screen share. Eric, is everybody seeing my presentation?
Yes, looks good.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roberta. So welcome everybody, and thank you, Eric, for that foundation on why sustainability is so important and why it's so important for all of us to be preparing for what we know will be future wildfires in our community and in our environment. And hopefully many of you are already familiar with the UC Master Gardener program. Master Gardeners are volunteers who receive extensive training and volunteer in their communities to extend the academics of the University of California on the topics of home horticulture and sustainable landscaping to home gardeners in our communities. So I'm going to take you through some basics around fire exposures, and then touch briefly on plants and plant spacing, and then get into the details of what we've tried to distill down to simplify for you all the recommendations in the defensible space zones in the 0 to 100 foot area surrounding our homes and structures. So hopefully you're all familiar with the fire triangle. I hope you've all seen this before. That fire requires 3 components, and those are oxygen, heat, and fuel. And of course, the only one of those 3 that we can control and manage is fuel. And then taking a step beyond the fire triangle concept into fire behavior. Fire behavior is made up of fuel, weather, and topography. And again, the only component in there that we can control in our home landscapes is fuel. Very basically, it sounds a little ridiculous, but fuel is anything organic that is organic that can burn. And I've got a few examples here of examples of fuel in our home landscapes, such as the vegetation in our gardens, mulch, wood mulch, fencing, roofing, decks, furniture, arbors, trellises, planter boxes, right? All made of organic materials, hence they are fuel and have the potential to burn. So these are some newer depictions that we have that were developed by some advisors within the university for us that show the 3 basic types of fire exposures that can threaten our homes and structures. What's newer information for us is how we prepare for either a possible ember or a radiant heat exposure takes a different approach than direct flame contact. Historically, most of the education that we've received in the past on fire preparedness has primarily dealt with direct flame contact. But we know now, and we've had painful experience here in Sonoma County, that wind-blown embers are responsible for the majority of building ignitions. So preparing for embers and radiant heat is incredibly important for us. So how we plan for these 3 potential fire exposures involves different approaches. Again, classically, we focused on defensible space in the context of direct flame contact, and that really defensible space guidelines were developed based on the threat of direct flame encroaching on our properties. We now know that to prepare for an ember exposure, that you need to couple both home hardening along with defensible space recommendations. And we don't have enough time to go into home hardening details for you, but there are lots of amazing resources out there and available on that topic. And we also know that preparing for a possible radiant heat exposure So that could be an adjacent, say a shed in your garden catches on fire, and that radiant heat and temperature could ignite your home or another adjacent structure and or deck. Involves both hardening your home and reducing possible fuels in your defensible space and in proximity to your homes to reduce that potential radiant heat exposure. So just wanted to share this picture, which shows how embers can operate, especially with wind impacting often during a fire event. You can see the complexities of how those embers are moving around this interior patio. You can see the firefighter here who's pulling out organics or potential materials that could burn in what we call the ember defense zone, or that 0 to 5 foot perimeter around your structures, to try to prevent the home from catching on fire. But just very important context to see how embers can operate in alcoves and how they can blow around and potentially ignite organic materials and then potentially ignite your home. Okay, so let's start with some very basic defensible space principles. You want to start at your house and work out from there. So that means you want to undertake whatever home hardening you need to do, and then start, once you've gotten that project completed, then move out to start undertaking the work to create your defensible space. You want to make sure you're on an ongoing basis, removing all dead or dying plants and branches. You want to be removing what we call ladder fuels, and I've got some depictions in a few slides that show you what a ladder fuel is. The recommendation is to create islands or groupings of plants that are separated by non-combustible paths. And we'll go into some more detail on that in a few minutes as well. And then Jen will have some great examples for that for you as well in her presentation. You want to avoid planting or using mulch close to structures. And ongoing maintenance is essential. So you can't think that I've prepared my landscape this 1 year and now I'm done. We need to be continually monitoring our landscapes for making sure that our landscapes are maintained in optimal condition to be prepared for future fire events. Okay, so horizontal and vertical spacing are really key principles to understand in defensible space. And this visual depicts suggested horizontal spacing guidelines for groupings of plants. So you see in these scenarios, we're showing groupings of plants. This illustration also shows, based on the steepness or the degree of slope on your property, the suggested spacing that's recommended between these groupings of plants. So for a flat or less than 20% sloped area, the recommendation is to have 2 times the height of the outside shrub of these plant groupings, spacing between these plant groupings. Then, of course, due to the increased transmission of fire on steeper slopes, that plant grouping separation gets wider. The suggestion is wider on steeper slopes. So this is showing horizontal spacing again, but now depicting tree spacing guidelines. I want to highlight that these are recommendations from CAL FIRE within the 0 to 100 foot space around your home, but these are not mandated by law. But we do know it's crucial that you want to maintain spacing between your trees. And again, that spacing increases based on a higher degree of slope on your property. So we talked about both horizontal and vertical spacing being important. This is depicting that vertical spacing for you. This is that concept of ladder fuels that hopefully many of you are already familiar with. You want to make sure that you don't have you don't want to create something that can ignite and transmit fire up into a tree, which can increase the spread of that fire on your property and in the landscape. So the recommendation is to, number 1, limb up all your trees 6 feet from the ground. You see that illustrated here in the left on this graphic. And if you have any shrubs or ground covers under your trees, you want to make sure that you have a spacing of 3 times the height of that shrub to the lowest tree limb. So again, that's to reduce the possibility of having fire move from the ground plane up into the crown of trees. If at all possible, you want to avoid planting shrubs under trees for these reasons. Okay, so I want to stress that there's no such thing as fire-resistant landscaping. The University of California does not advocate for fire-resistant plant lists because the reality is that all plants can burn. It's much more important to consider where you place a plant in your landscape and then how you maintain it. So you really want to make sure that you're choosing plants that will grow to a size appropriate for the location that you've placed them. So when you pick up that small 4-inch pot at a nursery, you really want to make sure you understand how large that perennial shrub or tree is going to get, and make sure that you're placing it with appropriate spacing in your home landscape, so you don't have to be also constantly maintaining it to keep it at a smaller size, to keep it safer in your garden environment. Okay, let's dive into the 3 defensible space zones. Again, it's incredibly important to recognize and remember that you want to start out with hardening your home and undertaking initiatives to do that first, before you then move out and work through the 3 defensible space zones in your landscape. So the first zone, which is relatively newer, Eric referred to some legislation that was enacted by the state of California in 2020 to mandate what's called Zone 0, also called the non-combustible or ember defense zone. And that's a 0 to 5 foot perimeter around your home and any surrounding structures. And I want to highlight that if you have a deck attached to your home, that zone 0 or that 0 to 5 foot perimeter extends around your deck. The next zone is called Zone 1, or the intermediate zone, which is the 5 to 30 foot perimeter around your home and structures. And then the extended zone beyond that is Zone 2, or the 30 to 100 foot perimeter around your home and your structures. And it's important to note that often your 5 to 30, or more likely your 30 to 100 foot zone may extend to a neighbor's property. So it's incredibly important, if that's the case, to be working with your neighbor in creating your shared defensible space and being prepared for future fires. Okay, so let's dive into some more detail on the recommendations within these 3 defensible space zones. So again, first zone is Zone 0, and is a really critical component of structure defense. And when coupled with zones 1 and 2 is really essential to defensible space. So as I mentioned earlier, this is also called the Ember Defense Zone. I want to stress that not only is it supported by state of California legislation, but it's supported by extensive scientific research. And it reduces the likelihood of structure ignition by reducing the potential for direct ignition of the structure from flame contact, either by embers that can accumulate at the base of a wall, and or indirect ignition when embers ignite vegetation or any other organic materials that you may have in this zone. So we want to reduce the chance of wind-blown embers from a fire landing near the home and igniting, and then transmitting the fire to the structure. So since it's the zone that's closest to the house, it requires the most careful selection and management of vegetation and other possible fuels. Classically, we have massed shrubs against the house called foundation shrubs. So this is really a big shift away from how we have traditionally designed our landscapes. But we really need to think about the fuel that this generates for fire in immediate proximity to our structures. Optimally, you want to have no combustible materials in this zone. Eric didn't speak to fire severity zones, but it's important to, when you're doing your own personal risk assessment, to understand what fire severity zone you're in. For example, I live northeast of Cloverdale, and I'm in a very high fire severity zone adjacent to wildlands. So I'm particularly higher at risk. So I am absolutely ensuring that I have a full zone 0 implementation around my structure. So you want to eliminate or minimize all plants or other flammable materials in this zone. If you absolutely have to have plants in this zone, you want to make sure that you're using low perennial or succulent plants. And if you remember back to that embers picture and that fire trying to defend the home, you want to make sure you don't have any plants under windows or in corners. So the recommendation really, especially in higher fire severity zones, is that zone 0, that 0 to 5 feet around your structures, should be inorganic or non-combustible mulches or materials. Ideally, hardscape and walkways are perfect application in zone 0. We've got some great depictions here that show you can get creative. It doesn't have to be ugly. It can be just as simple as a gravel application. I certainly have some areas around my house that I haven't got the gravel in that's just bare dirt. And I make sure that I'm maintaining that so it stays weed free during fire season. But especially if you're in a higher fire risk area, you want to do a full implementation of zone 0. So we aren't suggesting that you have to remove trees if they're in this zone. Trees provide really important services such as shade during the summer to reduce the energy needs inside your home. But the most important aspect to consider with trees closer to your home is what debris they drop, and that you then need to maintain on your roof and in the zones immediately around structures. It can make maintenance easier if you remove any limbs within 5 feet of your roof. And it is a Sonoma County code requirement to keep any tree limbs removed within 10 feet of a chimney or a stovepipe outlet. So during red flag warning days, if you do have trees in proximity and they're dropping debris in your 0 to 5 foot ember defense zone, you want to make sure, especially during fire season, that you're staying on top of keeping all that removed. And especially on a red flag warning day, that you're cleaning up that area to reduce the potential of embers igniting any of that leaf debris during a fire event. Okay, let's move on to zone 1, which is the 5 to 30 foot zone around your structures. And this is commonly referred to as the home defense zone. And this is typically where firefighters will be staged when defending your home. So it's really important to consider that they have access. Your focus in this zone is to modify the fuels and create a discontinuity or a break. That's when I talked about those planting islands, a break between planting groups to reduce the opportunity to fire to have a pathway to burn through that organic material to the structure, and also to reduce the potential for near to building ember generation and radiant heat exposure. So again, the recommendation is to plant in islands or groupings of plantings that are separated by pathways to break up the path of fire transmission. You can use, so we talked about only using inorganic materials such as gravel or concrete or pavers in zone 0. You can use wood mulch in zone 1. Again, if you're in a higher fire severity zone, you might want to consider making those breaks or those pathways between these planting groups inorganic materials such as gravel to reduce your risk. You certainly can consider inclusion of a shrub or trees in zone 1, but optimally it might be just a single tree or shrub. So you're reducing your woody mass in this zone with proximity to your home and structure. Ideally, you would want to make sure that you're focusing on small shrubs and perennials to a maximum of 3 feet in height. Again, as I mentioned, some larger specimen shrubs are okay if they're placed well and maintained well, and trees are fine. Again, you want to make sure you're keeping them well pruned and avoiding any ladder fuels. Okay, in zone 2, which is the 30 to 100 foot zone around your structures, called the reduced fuel zone, we really have the same basic principles that we had in that 5 to 30 foot zone, but you can include more shrubs and trees in widely spaced groups. These vegetation requirements, modification requirements, are again more significant for those on properties with steeper terrain, with larger and denser fuels, and areas that are subject to more frequent fires. So you want to continue your focus on creating islands of plantings or vegetation with horizontal spacing between them, and between the trees and shrubs, and vigilance on ladder fuel removal, and again, continuing to regularly remove any dead plant material. I do want to highlight that it is a Sonoma County code requirement that all annual grasses must be mowed to 4 inches in height during fire season. So this is a photo from an experiment where combustible mulch, you can see down here at the base of this wood fence, ignited the wood fence. So the recommendation is that you don't have a wood fence or gate connection to your home, as that can transmit that fire directly to your structure. So ideally, you would have a metal gate or some other type of inorganic material in your gate that's making the home connection. And you can see also that in this picture that they've got a rock mulch in this zone 0, which also helped prevent the spread of fire to the building. So we all know that a good layer of mulch can help with weed suppression and water conservation. So it's a really important aspect of a sustainable landscape. But again, wood mulches are organic, and as such, those are materials which can burn and transmit fire. So it's recommended to not use mulch in a widespread or a continuous manner. You want to separate areas mulched with these materials with non-combustible materials such as concrete or gravel, or even a native grass lawn. There was a scientific research study conducted by the University of Nevada at Reno and the University of California that recommended choosing larger sized composted arbor mulch. It was the least combustible in a study of 8 different mulch treatments in that study. It's definitely recommended that you don't use shredded bark mulch, also known as gorilla hair. Embers can fall into the shredded bark mulch and smolder. And if firefighters have moved on to defend another home, they might not catch it, and it can reignite and potentially spread to your structures. And again, want to stress, it's incredibly important, especially in higher fire severity zones, to do no organic or wood mulch within 0 to 5 feet of your home and structures. I will say that there's a new study that's been conducted by a colleague of ours, very well respected, Dr. Stephen Quarles. He's been doing a new study for us on mulch in Marin County, and I'm anxiously awaiting the publishing and reporting of his results. So we have some updated and new information for us on recommendations for mulch and what are more combustible mulches in our home landscapes. Again, I can't stress enough how important ongoing maintenance is for maintaining your preparedness against future wildfires. Again, you want to be continuously removing any dead or dying branches from trees and shrubs. You want to mow any annual grasses and weeds to 4 inches tall during fire season. You want to prune out any dead material that can accumulate from the interior of woody shrubs. You want to be removing any ladder fuels and be keeping an eye to thinning and reducing your tree canopies. It's also important to consider access to your property. You need to maintain vegetation within 10 feet of any road edge. Here's our road edge, so you need to be maintaining your vegetation within 10 feet of that road edge and 15 feet vertically. And optimally maintaining 12 feet of unobstructed pavement for the passage of not only your vehicles if you're having to evacuate for, but also for fire vehicles if they're coming to defend your home. So just as a final recap, and sorry, I realize this is in Spanish only, but sorry I didn't get the English on this one. But I think it's pretty straightforward. In our 3 defensible space zones, in zone 0, you want to have no organic materials if possible. Use inorganic materials such as gravel or stepping stones. In zone 1, the 5 to 30 foot zone around your home, you want to plant in islands with materials such as low herbaceous or non-woody perennials, grasses or succulents, and perhaps an individual shrub or tree is optimal. And in zone 2, the 30 to 100 foot zone around your house, we have the same basic principles as zone 1, but you can include shrub and tree groupings in widely spaced groups, separated by areas that break up the spread of wildfire. And with that, I'm going to close and turn it over to, hold on, you're seeing my scary work screen there. Turn it over to my colleague, Jennifer Roberts, who's going to take you through some more applied examples of translating all this information I just shared with you about defensible space recommendations with some beautiful pictures and depictions of this in some real landscapes. So I'll turn it over to Jen.
All right, thank you, Mimi. Okay, so to get going with a little bit more about the design aspects of what we can do in our defensible space zone. So I am Jennifer Roberts, and I'm a landscape designer and environmental educator here in Sonoma County. And today I am representing my work with Habitat Corridor Project. April Owens is the executive director of the Habitat Corridor Project and also a founding member of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition. And the mission of the Habitat Corridor Project is to create and promote California native plant restoration gardens in the urban environment. So we mostly work locally here in Sonoma County, but our mission is to create gardens all throughout California that use our native plants so that they give a space for pollinators to thrive, whether they're migrating or staying put. So, what are resilient landscapes? We talked a lot about that this evening, but these 4 criteria are the main thing that we focus on when we're creating designs. So first of all, they are fire-wise and they use the defensible space principles. Next, they try to conserve water or use plants that are drought tolerant. They are sustainable and they are biodiverse, using California native plants. So, why do we make such a big deal about California native plants? Why do we use them so much in our designs? Well, there's plenty of reasons. First of all, they are well adapted to our specific climate. They're also adapted to our water cycle. So we have dry summers and wet winters, and these plants are expecting that type of cycle. California natives are also adapted to our soils. We have some very interesting soils in California, and a lot of them are actually very low in organic matter. California plants also support our native fauna, including our pollinators. And of course, they are beautiful. If we have a well-designed, resilient garden, there are many ecosystem services that can be provided by our garden. So first one is it can help enrich the soil. These plants in these gardens can shade and cool our homes. They can sequester carbon. So that is where plants are actually taking excess carbon dioxide that is in our atmosphere, taking it out of the atmosphere and putting it down into the soil. So there's a lot of new exciting research around that happening currently. So look into that if you're interested. These types of gardens can also manage stormwater. They hold soils in place, provide cover, support pollinators, and clean our water and air. So it's been mentioned many times, but when we design for defensible space within the 3 zones that we've learned about tonight, so in the first zone, the 0 to 5 foot zone, we recommend no plants. So you can see here in this drawing, here is the structure, the home, and surrounding in that first 5 feet, we have decorative rock, cobble, maybe large boulders, and there's no plant material with the exception of these large, likely very well established and well maintained. Moving outward to the 5 to 30 foot zone, we are allowed to have islands of plants. So that's depicted here. And you can see they're surrounded by a non-combustible material. That's our ideal scenario. So moving outwards, once again to the 30 to 100 foot zone, we're allowed to have even larger islands of plants and more shrubs. And I'll touch more on that. So in zone 0, our first zone, we recommend having patios and pathways, decorative rock, and boulders. So you can see here, we have a couple different kinds of rock represented, and we also have hardscape using concrete. The picture below it depicts other types of decorative rock that we like to use. We like to play around with color and different size stones. And then you can see beyond it using a larger rock wall. And one of our favorite things to do is use materials that are already on site. So if you have rocks available, we love incorporating that in our design. In the 0 to 5 foot zone, you can also have water features. We especially like ones that are made of stone. And I think I have an example of that coming up. And you can have some containers with annuals or non-native plants, depending on the material of the container, of course. And we are not strictly all native plants. So if you have a favorite plant that you just cherish and you're always going to want that, we do allow that, of course. And some notes you'll see throughout these photos here that are generally in green. They say exactly what kind of materials are used in each picture. And don't worry, this full slideshow will be available to you all. We will send it so you can go back through and see what some of these materials are called. Here is another picture depicting what we call good 0 to 5. So meaning it has non-combustible material closest to the house. And then you can see these islands of plants as we move further away. Here's another example where this landscape had an existing patio and the plants that were closest to the home were removed and replaced with a decorative rock. This actually allows for this space to have even more entertainment space than previously it did have. And then you can see beyond, starting with the islands of plants. Here's another example of good 0 to 5. where there's a lot of, or generous use of decorative rock. And the only things that we see closest to the home, for the most part, non-combustible materials. If we are going to have things like a barbecue or planters, then we do want to make sure that they are movable. So on a red flag warning day or in the event of evacuation, moving these materials further out away from the home is the way to go. And here again, you can see our islands of native plants. Another alternative for working in the 0 to 5 is some turf grass. So this is a very specific species. It's a native species. It's called no-mow bent grass. And if you place this close to a home, often we use it sparingly. We use it in small strips or a little area. But the key to using this is it has to be well maintained. So that means well hydrated and mowed. And this can be mowed very short or kept a little bit longer when we're not in high fire season. And then we have using stone here as a fire break and then moving outward to the rest of the landscape. Okay, moving on to the next zone. So for the 5 to 30 foot zone, we also love to design using stone walls and borders. But here we get into being able to have well-hydrated and maintained islands of plants. And being in that first zone, we tend to choose a lot more ground covers. And then we might have a larger shrub as a specimen plant. So we don't have just a whole island of very tall, dense plantings. We're trying to keep something smaller and then maybe taller things in the middle with low things surrounding it. These islands can be 3 feet by 10 feet. That's a good estimate. It's a good amount of space to work with, being closer to structures. And we always like to use pathways as a separation of these islands. So using non-combustible material, creating a pathway or a space where you move through your landscape that separates these islands. Here are some examples of those ground covers we like to use in the 5 to 30. This is a list. We like to use, there's a coyote brush ground cover, and there's a buckwheat and a salvia or a sage. So this is just for some inspiration. We also love to use flowering perennials in the 5 to 30 foot zone. We love color. And I like to call these two plants out specifically because they tend to do well with a lot of heat. So one thing we've noticed as we've transitioned into using a lot more hardscape and rock is that those materials hold on to heat very readily. And the plants that are planted near them can suffer if they don't like heat. But this verbena, the purple, Verbena de la Mina, and Epilobium canum, this reddish orange plant, here's a close-up, they can better tolerate the heat. So just a little tip. So we also like to promote a lot of biodiversity. We try to use a lot of different plants and also plants that flower at different times throughout the year. So you might recognize the manzanita in bloom here, very common California native. We have sage. This is ceanothus or California lilac, monkey flower, and coffeeberry. So the advantages to a lot of these plants is that I'm just showing one species, but there's many species of these plants. So you can really pick and choose, you know, texture, different colors, and different sizes of each of these plants to create a beautiful palette. So I've been talking about these islands a lot, but what do we do between the islands? Remember, we want some kind of separation. maybe a pathway, or maybe rock. So we use rock, gravel, and crushed rock. We also use hardscape. So this can be concrete. These could be flagstones. So you can really get creative. You don't have to have this very modern looking design. You can also have a very flowing and natural looking garden using similar materials. And then again, calling out that type of grass, the bent grass, that is something that can be used between the islands. We also have a red fescue, which is a California native grass that is good to use too, because of the way it grows, it kind of clumps together and can be mowed to mimic a traditional lawn. Now, in talking about these separations, moving outward from structures, sometimes people who have smaller landscapes think, this isn't for me. I can't make a lot of difference on my landscape. My garden's too small. And that's simply just not true. This is, a typical California landscape or American landscape with a lawn, a shrub that has been heavily shaped, and then a porch. But this client wanted to be able to use more of their front yard. So we gave them a patio. So now they have a bigger entertainment space, came in with California natives, and created a lush habitat garden for them that they can now enjoy from their patio. And you do not need a lot of space to do this, yet we're still following the guidelines. Okay, moving on to our last zone. This is where we can have even larger islands of plantings, and the plants can get a little bit bigger. So the rule for once you move to the 30 to 100-foot zone is that you can have islands as big as 15 feet by 6 feet. So more space to work with. But each of these islands should have at least 4 feet of spacing between them. So making sure there's some kind of separation. And here's where we like to use a lot more bunch grasses and larger shrubs. Here's another design that was done in the 30 to 100-foot zone. So you can see we have an island of plants here, separated by rock walls. So closer to the house in the 0 to 5 foot zone, there is that well-hydrated bent grass. Then we have a rock wall, an island, and another rock wall. And this whole property is on a slope. So the advantage to using rock walls is we're working with the way that fire travels up a hill. So we're providing more fire break, more opportunity to stop that fire from continuing to move forward or closer to the structure. Okay, another important part of a resilient garden is keeping water on site. So we say we like to slow it, spread it, and sink it. So when water's rushing through, we don't want it all to leave. We want it to stay. So we use different design techniques to make that happen. One of them is we use swales. So that just means we create a depression in the landscape, and then we often fill it with decorative rock or bigger stone. We incorporate boulders, and we bring in plants that are okay with having their feet wet, we say, or they like to live in a more wet environment. So when we have a big rainstorm, this is filled up, slows the water, and it allows it to sink into the landscape. Another way to do that is by using a rain garden. This is a very good way to really let that water sink into the native soil over time. And the advantage to this is that it will continue to feed the plants around it. Plants around it will use their roots to find that water that has been allowed to sink in. And then I'll touch on the other ways that we get water into our garden. One of the most common is using drip line. And this is a grid of drip technique where we place drip line up and down the landscape. We plant the plants, and then we put what are called emitters out to the different plants so they get water fed directly to them. But when we do it this way, this is not a one and done technique. It does involve maintenance. So we do need to keep going back, revisiting the plants and adjusting the water as the plants grow. Another way of delivering water to a landscape is using sprinklers. And we've had a lot of luck with using these specific heads. They're called MP rotators, and they're by the brand Hunter. We normally don't like to call out like very specific brands of materials of anything, but we have had such success with these because they are very efficient flow sprinklers. So these actually help us conserve water, and they can easily be replaced in your existing landscape. Another easy way to conserve water is to replace a traditional lawn with one of those more drought-tolerant grasses that I've mentioned. And Eric did touch on this, but we like to, use a lot of different buzzwords in this field, and we talk about biodiversity, but our definition of biodiversity is 80% California natives and 20% of other plants, hopefully your favorite pollinator plants, or annuals, maybe in containers. Just a tip for replacing one of the plants we see a lot of. This is lavender, and it is unfortunately non-native, but it is adapted to our Mediterranean climate, so it does thrive very well here. But if you want to consider switching it out for a native, we recommend Cleveland sage, that's what's right here, or Salvia clevelandii, because it does give the same look in the garden. And it also does have a scent to it, although it's not the lavender scent. But pollinators also love this sage. Just a few quick notes on maintenance, because we all have mentioned how important maintenance is for a resilient garden. So we're always talking about right plant, right place. You could have a good native and you could have it in the wrong place. So something to be mindful of. We always want to clean our tools, whatever tools we are using, to help keep our existing plants healthy. We like to leave the litter. That means leaving our leaf litter where it lies underneath the tree. So oak leaf litter, redwood leaf litter. We don't recommend using leaf blowers, except sparingly, but only using them on hardscape, not in the garden, because pollinators and lots of good bugs live in the litter. So we want to maintain that for them. Could be a different story during high fire season, but that's something we explore in another workshop. Landscape fabric, we don't really recommend because a lot of them are made from a plastic polymer, like meshing together different materials. They degrade, they photodegrade instead of biodegrade, so they're not helping the soil. So we have other techniques we recommend for that, including using mulch and possibly cardboard. If you want to learn more about maintenance, specifically with natives and specifically with defensible space, I give a full other workshop. It's 1 hour, and it's another free evening workshop like this. It will be on April 9th, and you can sign up on our website. Few last tips for successful habitat planting. You want to try and use many types of flowers, and that not only means like just different species, but different types of flowers. So butterflies like to land on a large pad of flower, And a lot of our native bees are indiscriminate. They like all different kinds of flowers. So having a wide variety really helps bring the pollinators. And also having them available in large groupings. So lots of flowers, maybe lots of the same kind, for pollinators to get the word out and come target your garden all at once. It's great if they can flower at different times and if they provide both nectar and pollen. So thank you so much for your attention. We will send out an email with the video recording and the slides. And then in a few weeks, we will also send out a post-workshop survey. So we just want to get feedback from you, what you learned in this program. Did you implement some of the things you learned? Or if you come up with more questions. So look out for both of those emails. And also you can contact me or April of Habitat Corridor Project if you have more questions about natives or are interested in getting started with a design. So here's our website at the top. Here are the 4 organizations that make up the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, and then a few more resources for you. Okay, and that concludes my part. Thank you.
Great. What fantastic presentations, hey, you guys? So we have a little more than 10 minutes for some Q&A. You guys did really good on the timing of the presentations. And I'm not sure how you want to manage the Q&A, if you want to go back to the ones we answered and share them with folks. I think we could probably do most of those in the time we have, or we can ask people to tell some new ones. What do you guys think?
I think we could answer the one that's waiting, perhaps.
Yeah, I think Jennifer covered that. Jennifer, you want to handle that? It sounded like it was 4 feet.
Talking about how wide pathways that separate the islands should be. And I think she asked that right before you shared that, Jen.
Yeah. So, and
which was generally like, I think 4 feet,
Yes.
right, is the
Yeah.
recommendation.
yeah,
And it looks like we have a new question. Will you provide more information on plants to encourage plant in forests that have been worked to reduce wildfire fuel? If we remove standing unhealthy trees, fallen trees, and invasive species, very important for fire preparedness, where do we plant and how do we decide how to treat the newly cleared land? Eric, over to you for beyond the 100-foot defensible space zone.
Yeah, so this is something that we'll cover more in depth in another workshop. That's a beyond defensible space, as we call it. Generally, the recommendation is to clear what you need to and then actually allow for natural revegetation. So what's growing there, generally what wants to grow there, and we should support it, but we can also manage how it grows and what it looks like so that you can make sure the fuels are in order so that you don't have ladder fuels, as were spoken about earlier, and you don't have things that might damage large older growth trees that you value, that offer shade and all the other ecosystem benefits.
so we can mark
And
it.
if anybody else has other questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. That looks like there was a lot of great questions around mulch that thank you, Roberta, for answering and providing some feedback on that. And that was something I covered. And keep an eye on both our UC Master Gardener program of Sonoma County Firewise webpage, as well as the Resilient Landscapes Coalition webpage. And as soon as that new mulch study is out, we'll load that up as a link and a resource. We can include it in some future communications and some social media as well. Follow us on Facebook if you want to get the latest tips. We have some great social media outreach and you can, learn about new scientific information that's coming out as soon as it's out.
And hopefully we're not talking too fast for the Spanish folks. I always forget that.
Yeah.
Also, some folks asked for the slideshows. How will those be made available for folks?
We will send a PDF in an email.
To all the attendees?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes. So if you signed up, and even if you didn't make it tonight, you will get that and a link to the recording.
Okay, it looks like there's a new question. I'm gonna handle this one. What do you recommend for wooden porches that have space beneath the porch down to the ground? Wind can blow, leaves underneath, etc. There's a couple ways to manage that. One is you just keep them raked underneath, like you take care of the rest of your yard. That's the economically advantageous method. Another way that people sometimes use to deal with it is they'll put some 1/8 inch mesh to enclose the area to prevent things from getting under there in the first place. In my opinion, when you do that, there's almost always ways for stuff to get under there anyway. So even if you do like the mesh around the area or enclosing that under deck space, you still want to make sure and check under there once in a while to make sure stuff isn't accumulating. Okay, hopefully that answered that. What about wooden pergolas? Should I not have potted plants under it?
So I'd say you want to think about your proximity to structures. I'd say it's like, I would call that like a garden shed that you probably want to consider like a 0 to 5 and making sure that it's not then spreading fire, to other plants and materials.
Yeah.
You could include potted plants, but based on your fire severity zone and, if you're on a red flag warning day, maybe you want to move those pots. Might be a little overly protective, but hey, if we've got the time on a red flag warning day, that's the time to take actions like that. And then certainly if you're evacuating, I mean, I've done that before when I've evacuated and before I've left the house, I've pulled pots away. So I think it's just about having a checklist in our mind of either doing it on a red flag, so you're not doing it if you have to evacuate in a rushed mode, and just kind of keeping in mind that the risk you're taking if you do include things and what you might need to do before you might have to evacuate.
Yeah, my rule of thumb, or imaginary litmus test, if you will, is imagine taking a red hot or white hot briquette coal out of your barbecue, going out in the middle of your yard, closing your eyes, throwing that thing up in the air and not caring where it lands. That's in my perfect world where we want to get to be. And with regard to the potted plants, like Mimi said, if they're in wood planters, make sure you can move those out of the 0 to 5 zone before you evacuate. And if they're large ones, put the casters underneath and be able to roll those out of the way, or have a hand truck nearby where you can get under there and wheel them out of the way or into your garage, someplace safe before you have to evacuate. And then Elizabeth asks, what do you recommend where there's a U-shaped part of the house?
Roberta, can we hit the climbing vine ones first?
Oh, sure, yeah.
So
climbing vines are no. Go ahead.
Climbing vines are a no if they're going up a tree. That's a ladder fuel, taking it from the ground level right up into the tree canopy, which furthers the spread of fire at the canopy level.
Yeah.
So big no going into trees.
Or on the house itself.
Or the house itself.
I imagine you could probably use them on a fence as long as you maintain that, non-combustible space, or section of fence between the combustible part in your house proper.
Yeah. So for example, I have a really beautiful native clematis vine. So stunning when it's in bloom. And it's on a short fence, probably about 6 feet from the house, the structure. I cut it down to like 1 foot during winter. So it's got all fresh new growth during the season. I make sure it's hydrated and well maintained. And then I annually I'm cutting it back to make sure it doesn't get any woody debris built up in its interior, because I'm not doing regular maintenance and cutting it back. So it's just about, again, keeping an eye to fire risk and doing regular maintenance to reduce that risk.
Yeah, and then Elizabeth question I'll take, and then I'll let one of you handle Anne's question.
What do you recommend when there is a U-shaped part of the house?
Yeah, so my
is-
recommend there is just treat that whole inside courtyard area, if you will, as the 0 to 5. I would try to keep everything combustible out of that space, or have it such that you can easily move combustible things out of that space. Because in that little alcove, the wind's gonna drag all kinds of stuff in there anyway, particularly if it's windy after you leave. And yeah, the less combustible materials you have in there for when the embers start dropping in there, the safer you're gonna be.
Okay, and then Roberta, looks like a question about redwood trees that are planted close together on a slope or next to the house. Don't want to thin them. Okay to ensure there are no ladder fuels and not remove them.
I was gonna let one of you guys handle that one.
So, yes. Redwoods drop a lot of leafy debris. For sure, you're going to want to make sure if it's dropping leaf debris in your 0 to 5 AM that you're keeping that cleared out during fire season, and especially vigilant on a red flag warning day. And then I think you're good. Yeah, Eric or Jennifer,
Yeah.
anything you would add on that?
Yeah, much like many native species here in California, they are, fire resilient and fire adapted. So, as long as they're not put next to other flammable things, they tend to do pretty well. And it's also beautiful if you can leave some of the multiple stems. Ultimately, they can grow together and create these like beautiful candelabra type trees. So, sounds wonderful.
Yeah, again, if they're right next to the house, so that can be a little risky. So, the degree of vegetation you have, as I think Eric alluded to in his presentation, depends a lot on your ability to maintain it, and what the amount of risk you're willing to take on in trade for, the beautiful landscape that you want to have in maintaining. Ellie's got a question.
Oh, it's not a question. I thought I had something to add to that. One thing that we haven't talked about is what kind of siding you have on your house. If you have cement board, like hardy board siding, that actually reduces your risk. It's much less flammable. If your redwoods are right next to an old redwood siding house or shingles, then your risk is much higher. If those redwoods were to catch fire, and if they're cleaned out, even up into the canopy, and it depends on how far they are from the house and how high they are. So it's all looking at your risk and assessing it and weighing it based on all of those conditions.
Yeah, and this isn't meant to be structural hardening, but at the same time, even if your house is stucco, there and your trees right next to it, there's a better than fair chance that your rafter tails, your under roof plywood, your roof edge itself is going to be real susceptible to anything that's right there next to that roof line, next to your house, etc. In a perfect world, you just, in the perfect world, you just not have anything in that 0 to 5.
Yeah. And so when we talked about that tree proximity to the house, it's all about what's it dropping on your roof, what's it dropping in your gutters, what's it dropping in your 0 to 5. And you have to be really vigilant about keeping that cleaned up during fire season.
Yeah.
And then someone asked if redwood debris is irrigated, so it's holding water, does it still need to be removed? Again, if it's in your 0 to 5 or on your roof or in your gutter, I'd say yes, right, Roberta?
Yeah, that stuff, I mean, that'll dry out so fast. I don't know what well irrigated pine needles look like, but I mean, that's gonna dry out so freaking fast with the wind and the heat.
Yeah.
It'll dry out unbelievably quick. Now, with that said, my recommend is if you have that and you haven't had a chance to rake that stuff away from your house, if you think you want to wet it down before you leave, my recommend is you get one of those garden sprayers, put about a half a cup or quarter cup of Joy soap or some kind of, good quality dish soap. Fill it with water and then put about a quarter cup of dish soap in there. Connect it to your garden hose and spray that around your house in those areas before you leave. It's a surfactant. It's going to stay there longer in the heat than regular water will. And it's going to penetrate the combustible material, a lot farther than the water itself will. Back in the days when I was a firefighter, we used to do that with the water extinguishers. We'd put Joy soap in there, and we would actually literally, in some fires, we'd have a squeeze bottle of Joy soap and just squirt it into the hose stream while doing mop up or attacking a fire, because it's an excellent surfactant and really penetrates the combustibles.
No matter how many of these workshops I've done, I learn something new every time. We had one last question. Do we want to tackle this last one quickly before we wrap up? I think we're a little over time. Nadja was asking about recommendations regarding solariums or attached greenhouses. Is there some benefit to maintaining a humid environment near a structure in terms of fire resilience? Roberta, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would just treat it as part of the house and, do the 0.5 around that.
Yeah.
I try to do that in my house. I have a couple oak trees at my house that are in the 0 to 5, then they're not going away. And so I just, imagine them as part of the house and try to keep space around those trees as if it was part of the house.
Yeah. Shall we wrap for this evening?
I think so.
Yeah, thank you guys for attending. Again, thanks for giving up your beautiful evening. Hope you finish that bottle of wine during the presentation. Yeah, check out the website, Resilient Landscape Coalition, lots of other material there. And, like the social medias and all that stuff if you like the material. So thank you guys.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, everybody.
And thanks to our interpreters. And Becca from Fire Safe Sonoma helping in the background on the Spanish channel. And Ellie for helping out, and all of you great presenters and smart people that know way more about this than I do, particularly with the plants anyway.
Thanks, Roberta.
All right. See you
Night,
guys.
everybody.